Thank you, Jort. It's funny to be talking to an empty auditorium, but I'm happy you're all here with me, virtually. So good afternoon, everyone. Like Jort already kindly introduced me, my name is Nadia de Vries, and I am a writer and cultural scholar. In my work, I mainly focus on the cultural representation of the human body, specifically the bodies of those who are sick, dying, or otherwise vulnerable. And I understand that this topic also relates specifically to the theme of this year's Studium Generale, hence also me being here today. Even more specifically than vulnerable bodies, however, I am particularly interested in the ethical questions that come into play when vulnerable bodies are used as academic or artistic material. And this brings me to my lecture topic for today: the responsibility of having, seeing, being a body, especially as working artists. It is my honor to be here today and share with you some of the ethical questions that I've been thinking about as part of my academic practice in the past couple of years. For the purpose of this lecture, however, as I just already indicated, I will be zooming in on the use of the vulnerable body in artistic practices in particular, considering the occasion of this lecture and the fact that all who are listening are, I assume, interested in the artistic production in at least some way. But before I continue, it might be helpful to further specify what I mean by ethical questions. For that, I first need to tell you more about the context in which I myself ask these questions. Last summer, I completed my PhD research about the digital circulation of dead and dying human bodies, as images and videos found in online environments that are based on shareability and malleability. So based on shareability and malleability. And that last bit, I repeat that because it's particularly important to my questioning, and I will expand more on that later. So many people ask me why I was drawn to such a morbid, or arguably morbid, topic for my PhD. And the reason for my interest is a rather personal one, based on various experiences I had in my childhood. I don't want to ruminate on these reasons too much in this lecture, but I will briefly tell you the backstory to my research project before moving on to the case studies I want to share with you today. In 2016, I started my PhD at the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis with a project titled Digital Corpses. You can see the cover behind me if you would have been in this room, but you can see it on the screen somewhere at home, I assume. So for my project, I wanted to research the various purposes that images of dead and dying bodies have in digital culture. I came to this topic as I myself was shocked by the violent images of death I sometimes encountered online without meaning to. The first of these encounters happened when I was only 9 years old and accidentally stumbled upon a picture of a burned human body via the shock site rotten.com, a platform that was widely popular for its extreme content in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And some of you might remember this website or have visited it on purpose or accidentally at some part of your online travels. So about this image that I saw when I was 9, I was horrified by it. I was horrified by the image and shock sites in general, and I tried to avoid them as best as I could. My efforts to stay away from shock sites notwithstanding, a horrifying image would still be sent to me by cruel online acquaintances every once in a while. This was what was considered entertainment at the beginning of the century, in a time when our internet use was not yet as rigidly restricted by the content filters of Facebook and Google. It was a form of entertainment that deeply disturbed me, although I did not yet have the language to express how exactly these images affected me. Why do people enjoy sharing these images? Do they have a purpose other than sadism and shock? And why was it suddenly okay to look at dead bodies in an online context when most images of death were withheld from me in everyday life? Was there a correlation between the two, perhaps? I remembered how, at each of my grandparents' funerals, the lid of the coffin had been closed before the ceremony started. I also recalled how there had always been a big controversy whenever a newspaper printed an image of a dead or dying body, because these images were considered too explicit, sometimes even too obscene to show. Years later, when I was finishing my MA in literary studies, I wrote a thesis about the internet's influence on contemporary literature. It was then when my interest in the intermingling of online and offline customs truly solidified. Around this time, my mind started to refocus on the topic of death and the way it was represented within online context. Again, I started to think about how death and illness appear to be solemn events in real life, with the intimacy of funerals and hospital beds, but catalysts for sensation and voyeurism in the online communities that I frequented, where depictions of death were often treated as laughingstock. And here, it might be useful to add that I enjoyed playing MMORPG video games, and that most of the other gamers I encountered were young men obsessed with violence. An additional detail that informed my interest in the treatment of vulnerable bodies is my own experience with having a serious illness. As a child, I was diagnosed with systemic mastocytosis, an autoimmune blood disease in which the body overproduces mast cells, leading to a range of symptoms such as nausea, headaches, and abdominal pain, as well as, in a worst-case scenario, a mast cell-related type of leukemia that is untreatable. Luckily, I myself was spared this type of leukemia, but the event of the illness deeply impacted my life and the way I look at human bodies and also health in general. And 2 years ago, I wrote a critical memoir about my experience with illness, Kleinzeer, to be translated into English as hypochondriac. And that's not like a direct translation, but it's the most suitable one in the context of the book's content. And I called the book a critical memoir because I did not want to write about my illness from a sentimental or mainly ego-driven perspective, but from a theoretical and activist perspective that questions the way in which we treat bodies that are deemed sick or weak. So from my position as a writer, I also have an interest in how to work with the body in a way that does not fetishize, sensationalize, or otherwise dehumanize its vulnerability. Considering the personal proximity I've had to death and illness in my life, my interest in the cultural representation of vulnerability, including that of death, will hopefully seem less random or morbid. And indeed, a couple of months after my MA graduation, I started writing a PhD proposal about the way that death and mourning are approached and represented within a digital setting. I wanted to get to the bottom as to why vulnerable bodies, particularly bodies as vulnerable as dead ones, became viewing fodder as soon as they were put on a screen. Whether it was a fictional dying body in a video game, or an image of a real dying person shared on social media platforms like YouTube, Twitter, or Instagram, I wanted to analyze what the function of these particular bodies were other than spectacle, if any. Specifically, I became interested in the way that bodies, once they are placed in such a digital context, seem to become, and here they come again, shareable and malleable objects. And this is why I previously mentioned these two terms as being important to my questioning, because indeed, an online image of a body is not just something to be looked at, but also something to potentially edit and share. And of course, this is a big facet of our meme culture where images can generate new meanings and context based on where they are used and how they are used. And this happens to extreme content as well, I found in my research. So one of the first things I learned when I began my research is that the online world is not separate from our offline traditions and customs for the body, including those to do with death. Instead, the online world is an inherent part of it. I learned about concepts such as IRL fetishism, which denotes the unjust assumption that things are better, more real, or more morally sound in real life versus things that are seen or done online. In reality, of course, online behaviors and trends work in tandem with those of the offline world and do not emerge out of thin virtual air. Similarly, I learned about the traps of so-called cyberspace idealism, which supposes that the online world is a place where the state of our physical bodies does not really matter, and that instead the digital realm offers endless possibilities to all with an interest in pursuing them. Everyone who's ever been the subject of sexual, racist, homophobic, or transphobic harassment online, however, knows that it is simply not true. As I mentioned before, multiple times now, an important feature of online images, and one that distinguishes them from other types of images, is that they can be easily reproduced, altered, and then reproduced again. Due to the global nature of online environments, this image reproduction process can take place on a massive scale and with high intensity. As a result of the online image's high shareability, as this feature is called in new media discourse, the reproduction and use of online images is hard to monitor and control. And this particular feature is significant to my study from an ethical point of view, because the online engagements with these digital bodies pose challenging questions in terms of agency, responsibility, and ownership. So with regards to these three ethical challenges in particular, or ethical aspects, you might say, I asked the following three questions in my PhD project. With what motivations and effects are images of dead bodies created, appropriated, and reappropriated online? What are the ethical stakes involved with when the image of a dead or dying body is reproduced on a digital platform? And what role do social constructions of gender, race, and disability play in these engagements with digital dead and dying bodies? As a way of answering these questions, I analyzed three different types of case studies for my dissertations. Dissertation, singular. Images of dead human bodies, fictional representations of dead human bodies, so video game characters, but also bodies created through artistic productions, and I will zoom in on two of those as case studies later in my talk. And finally, images of dying human bodies, so still alive but dying. And for each analysis, I looked at two main case studies per category and compared and contrasted them to see how exactly these digital corpses were mobilized as activist instrument, as socio-political tool, or as an object of exploitative and sensationalist entertainment. And I will not get into the further technical details of my questioning and research here. This mainly serves to kind of give you a context to where I come from when I talk about bodies and the analysis of how bodies are represented. But if anyone is interested in this particular topic, my dissertation is free to read online. But that's as far as I'm going to talk about my dissertation here. Now I'll move further to this, the artistic production focus that sits at the center of this lecture for today. So my conclusions about the representation of dead and dying bodies, however, apply to other types of representations of the body as well. For each body that is depicted, be it through image or through some other medium, there is a tension of power between the viewer and the viewed. And that's kind of funny to say right now when I'm on a screen and people are looking at me and I can't see them. This power dynamic informs or compromises the agency, responsibility, and ownership of the viewed, thereby making the act of viewing an ethically charged one. And this brings me to the topic of my lecture for today: the responsibility that we have as makers and thinkers when we choose to use the human body as our main material. In the remainder of this lecture, I will be analyzing the ethical responsibility that is taken towards the body of the other in 4 different artworks. 2 of these analyses are of older works taken from my thesis, and 2 are of more recent works that were on show in Dutch museums in the past year. Of both the older and the newer examples, I would describe one work as a do, as in a good example of how to work with the body, and one work as a don't, with regards to how they take up the human body as an artistic material. So I will start with the 2 older examples from my thesis. And the first one I would like to discuss with you, and which is a do, or I would describe as a do, is Patchwork Girl by Shelly Jackson, an interactive software hypertext that was also the cover image for this event, so you might recognize this picture from there. For those of you who are not familiar with her work, Shelly Jackson is an American cross-genre author. She teaches at the New School in New York, and her work usually consists of a mix between analog and digital media. For Patchwork Girl, she was inspired by the story of the Frankenstein monster from Mary Shelley's eponymous novel from 1818. Jackson was intrigued by the coincidental similarity between her name and Shelley's, Mary Shelley, Shelly Jackson, and decided to interweave her own life story with that of Shelley's to build a narrative that centers the monstrous feminine rather than the monster, as in Mary Shelley's original. So while I was taking a sip of water, you could have looked at this image, which is the main interface of the Patchwork Girl hypertext. And the body in Patchwork Girl, which you can maybe see in this image, where it is fully reassembled. But the body in Patchwork Girl is fragmented, as you can see here. It's fragmented and requires reassembly. The point of the hypertext is that the reader, or user, drags and drops the various fragments of the body until they form a whole. By interacting with each of these body parts by clicking on them, the reader gradually uncovers the details of the Patchwork Girl's story. Each body part contains a different strand of the Patchwork Girl's narrative. By moving and rearranging the body parts, the reader effectively steers the Patchwork Girl narrative, thereby not only completing the corpse's body, but also designing their own telling of the Patchwork Girl story based on the order in which the narrative strands are activated. The Patchwork Girl interface, which is now on screen if you can look at it, the interface consists of 5 chapters: a graveyard, a journal, a quilt, a story, and broken accents. Like the drag and droppable body parts, the Patchwork Girl's narrative realm is fragmented into different parts, segmented into chapters. Yet the emphasis on anatomical physicality as subject to gendering is clear throughout. The broken accents chapter, which you can see in the back, for example, takes the reader to a fictionalized phrenology guide through which readers are invited to consider the genetic flexibility of female bodies versus that of biologically male ones. The text's other chapters consist of more traditional narrative constituents. They supply various perspectives on Patchwork Girl's main storyline, detailing the journey of the girl's body from her homeland to her final resting place, where she becomes the interactive corpse that the reader is faced with. And here you can see a detail of the phrenology guide. And for those who don't know, phrenology was this 19th century medical practice, or ideology perhaps is more apt, where the shape of the head would kind of determine how smart or strong or capable you are, and all your neuroses could be explained by how your head was shaped, the idea was. And what Jackson did with that here is that she put all these very gendered aspects in this head of like, oh, playing hopscotch and women's names and kind of, because of course the idea in the 19th century was that women were less, capable than men, and she's playing with that 19th century idea here. So the body in Jackson's hypertext then is used to assert a feminist critique. Jackson is aware that the non-masculine body is often assigned a passive role in visual culture, and she paradoxically subverts this passivity by presenting the female body in what is arguably the most passive state possible, that of the dead. However, due to the interactive nature of Patchwork Girl, the reader is implicated in this passive presentation of the female. Through the grotesque act of stitching together the body parts of a dead woman, the main task that is set by the text, I'm going to say that again, apologies. Through the grotesque act of stitching together the body parts of a dead woman, the main task set by the text, the reader is confronted with both the extremity of their required task, as well as the human story behind the body they are reassembling through the various fragmented limbs that literally speak back to them. I find Jackson's use of the female body as material particularly interesting in this regard, because it challenges the assigned passivity of feminine flesh by perpetuating this passivity in its most extreme form, thereby making the ethical wrongness of the body's narrative appropriation inescapable to the reader, viewer, user. Also, it is important to note here that the vulnerable body used in Patchwork Girl is a fictional one. No real-life bodies are implicated. And Jackson did go into a non-fictional direction for her follow-up hypertext, My Body a Wunderkammer, but as the title of this work implies, she exclusively uses her own body as material for this project. And I think this is an important detail to mention with regards to agency, as Jackson does not instrumentalize any bodies that represent lived experiences besides her own. So to not instrumentalize any bodies that represent lived experiences besides her or your own. And this brings me to my second example, which I would consider a don't. The No Goes Just a Shell project by French artist duo Pierre Huyghe and Philippe Perrino. And for those who are unfamiliar with this exhibition, I will first outline its backstory before I move on to my criticism of it. In 1999, Huyghe and Perrino acquired a female manga character from K-Works, a Japanese design company that provides character templates for animations, comics, and other graphic narratives. The character of the two artists choosing was a rather cheap template, a one-dimensional girl without any distinctive characteristics, lacking the details of more expensive templates for protagonists. Within the anime series industry, a template of a character like this would have been used as a background character in a few frames at most, before being set aside forever. Huyghe and Perrino, however, acquired the character with a more ambitious goal in mind: to give it life. And here you can see the actual template as Huyghe and Perrino bought it from the catalog. And as you can see here in the beginning, when they actually started working with Anne Lee, they made her hold up the template as a kind of mirroring of look who I was, look who I am now. So the artist's mission was to animate the character in both senses of the word, as a moving image and as a living actor. They also sought to give her a history, identity, and unique personality. As if the template were another digital monster of Frankenstein, the artist set out to elevate its status from that of an image to that of a body. The first step of this vivification process was to give the character a name: Anne Lee. The next step was to make the digital template mortal. A vital part of the project, Huyghe and Perrino decided, was that Anne Lee eventually had to die like any other living being. But first, Anne Lee had to live. And so, in order to give her a life, Huyghe and Perrino offered the character as a canvas to other prominent artists, commissioning them to make an offline artwork with Anne Lee at its center. All contributing artists were given the same instructions. Work with her in a real story, translate her capabilities into psychological traits, lend her a character, a text, a denunciation, and address to the court in her defense. Do all that you can so that this character lives different stories and experiences, so that she can act as a sign, as a life logo. So, Weig and Perino's instructions offer a rich insight into the perception and distribution of agency, responsibility, and ownership on which the An Lee project is based. First, it is significant to point out that artists were not asked to give her a character, but to lend her one, as if this character could later be revoked. Second, the phrase "in her defense" suggests that the end product of An Lee, while attributed with character, would not have the ability to defend herself. While the artists were asked to give An Lee life, in other words, this life was supposedly restricted to a docile existence in which An Lee would not be able to manifest herself as an autonomous being with agency, capable of standing up for her rights, or to assert herself in any legal sense of personhood. Thirdly, Weig and Perino did not explicitly ask the artist to make An Lee a person. Instead, they commissioned a sign, a life logo. The life that was to be given to An Lee was thus a life that was available to be appropriated and instrumentalized. It was conceived not as an individual existence, but as a sign, for the artist's purposes or for the viewers, but not for the individual that An Lee herself was or should be. From the outset of Weig and Perino's project, the bringing to life of An Lee was meant to serve not herself as an autonomous fictional creature, but rather to gratify her viewers and co-creators. The artworks resulting from the open invitation to work with An Lee were exhibited together under the title "No Ghost, Just a Shell." However, in the weeks following the exhibition's opening, Weig and Perino started to realize that the premise of their project was not as harmless as they initially thought. They began to see that claiming ownership of another person's life, fictional or otherwise, had political implications that complicated their project beyond its intended playfulness. As such, they decided to give the rights to the An Lee image back to An Lee herself, meaning that she could never be reproduced again. In effect, as An Lee was a fictional character and therefore only existed as an image, this decision meant her death. And here you can see the final reproduction of An Lee. This was during Art Basel, Miami, and they made a big firework display of her face, of her shape like her face. And of course, a firework is a very ephemeral medium, and they used that as a kind of a goodbye to her image reproduction. And the contract in which they sold the rights to An Lee back to An Lee was actually put on display as part of the No Ghost, Just a Shell exhibition. So Weig and Perino's executive decision to terminate An Lee revived the question regarding An Lee's agency and responsibility for her own life in other ways. In an essay for Art Asia Pacific, Chinese film director Chin Yap questioned the artist's decision and rightly asked, "Did An Lee really wish to disappear? Might she not have desired to own her copyright while she was alive rather than dead?" One could add to this that Weig and Perino could have considered the ethical implications of An Lee's visual exploitation before extending their invitation for collaboration to other artists. They might as well have given the rights to An Lee straight after they acquired them from K-Works. Besides the problem of ownership, Yap also addressed the racist and sexist stereotyping at work in No Ghost, Just a Shell. In her words, ultimately, the installation boiled down to, quote, "a narrative of a young, powerless Asian female who was given form and then silenced by a pair of white Frenchmen," unquote. Even as a fictional character, Anne Lee is not the clean slate as which Weig and Perino marketed her to their fellow artists, but is subject to the same socio-political power dynamics as representations of non-fictional bodies. Whereas Jackson's Patchwork Girl and Weig and Perino's No Ghost Just a Shell both take a fictional image of a human body as their center, there is one crucial difference. Jackson uses a body that represents her own lived experience and mobilizes it as a criticism of the power dynamics that govern it. Weig and Perino, on the other hand, use a representation of a body that is different from their own lived body experience, and most importantly, one that is more vulnerable than their own cis male and white bodies. In addition, they did not use the image of Anne Lee to criticize this power imbalance, but to reproduce it under the flag of artistic experimentation and play. As such, I think these two works form an interesting juxtaposition in that both operate on the same premise, using the template of a fictional body for artistic means, yet with different results. One shows the potential of the fictional body as a socio-political critique, while the other demonstrates the ethical pitfall of instrumentalizing an other's body. An important and perhaps overly obvious pointer that these works show us, I think, is that as artists, it can do more harm than good to use the lived experience of another to enact your own agenda, how well-intended that agenda may be. And this leads me to a more recent work that I would like to discuss with you, and one that I'm sure you've already heard much about. Destroy My Face by Dutch artist Eric Kessels. And this project, and you can see it on the screen at home, I can see it here. It was shown at the Pier 15 skate park in Breda as part of the Breda Photo Fair in the fall of last year. It opened at the beginning of September 2020. The work consists of a large collage of women's faces, not real women's faces, but faces artificially generated via algorithmic software and printed on 4 meter by 4 meter stickers that were stuck onto the floor of Pier 15's main skating rink. And the idea was, and you can see it in the image, that Pier 15 visitors and skaters could then skate on these images, thereby damaging the stickers and destroying the faces, as the title of the work describes. And so all these stickers were of women, and the idea was to critique contemporary women's vanity. That was the idea behind the work. But as I'm sure will not surprise you, Kessel's work was heavily criticized upon the Breda Photos exhibition's opening in September. So 2 months later, after various sponsors that financed the annual photo fair threatened to halt their funding, Breda Photos organization decided to close Kessel's contribution to the fair. After Destroy My Face's removal from the exhibition, new critics appeared and argued that the removal of Kessel's work was a prime example of today's so-called cancel culture. In their public statement in response to the controversy, Pier 15 offered that Kessel's work was an attempt to open a dialogue about the border between realistic bodies and the photoshopped body, and that Destroy My Face was intended as a critique on the contemporary tendency towards Instagram perfection. That's their terminology, Instagram perfection, which a spokesperson for Breda Photo notes is marked by an obsession with fillers, filters, and cosmetic surgery. And here you can see more clearly what the images look like. The extent to which this Instagram perfection indeed plays a role in Instagram users' lives is a different discussion. But what is important here, I think, is that as with Weig and Perino's project, Kessels explicitly used a representation of another lived body experience to voice his message. On top of that, there is hardly any useful critical potential in a male artist's use of women's likenesses to explore the realm of physical idealization and fantasy. This approach to bodily representation has been used for centuries. And behind me, or on your screen, you can see two classic works of the past, from the 1700s and 1900s. or no, wait, I'm saying that wrong, the 17th century and the 19th century. Has been used for centuries, this approach to the female bodies and their representation. And so applying this strategy to a contemporary topic such as Instagram does not in any way innovate the discourse that the work tries to latch onto. What Kessel's work demonstrates then is that the form of a work can be as out there and original as algorithmically designed stickers on a public skating rink, which is in itself a pretty cool idea. But the innovativeness of this form counts for nothing if the subject of a work perpetuates the same motifs and stories that we've seen in artistic renditions for ages. So when working with a representation of a body as a main material, be that body fictional or real, Kessel's Destroy My Face reminds us that we have to inform ourselves of the coded sociopolitical positions that these bodies represent, and particularly their relation to the body that we inhabit ourselves. And as a final example, and also to end this lecture on a more inspiring note perhaps, I would like to share a recent work that I think tackles the precarity of working with a body of a vulnerable other really well. And this work is so recent, in fact, that were it not for the current lockdown, you could go see it in an Amsterdam-based museum right now. But unfortunately, we are in the middle of a lockdown. And this work is Ik ben mijn lichaam niet, or in English, I am not my body, by filmmaker Vanessa Abajos Perez and poet Maud van Auwert. And this documentary and object installation is on view at the Tot Zover Museum until April of this year. And COVID numbers permitting, you maybe could see it again sometime later. And so there's a documentary. A documentary is the centerpiece of this exhibition, together with like this object installation and a poetry collection that's interactive. But the documentary is the main show, you could say, or the main piece. And in the documentary, Abajos Perez made a video portrait of a woman who was dying from terminal breast cancer. The filmmaker met the woman when she was doing research on popular depictions of terminal cancer, so when Abajos Perez was doing research, after one of her close relatives had died from severe cancer the year before. The dying woman had invited Abajos Perez to document her final weeks after she learned about her research. "You are reading about all these dying bodies," she said, "but you might as well study an actual one." On an ethical level, however, Abajos Perez struggled to put a camera in the face of a woman who only had a couple of months left to live. She did not want to reproduce the sensationalist perspectives that are common in reality TV shows about people with terminal illness. So instead, she decided to document the traces that the woman left behind in her house during her final phase of life. The shoes she wore, the teacups she drank from, and the pet cat that liked to sit in her lap. The face of the woman herself, however, is never shown. So by centering the everyday objects within the dying woman's life, instead of the woman's actual dying body, Abajos Perez amplified the humanity of the woman as a living individual, rather than her arguably dramatic status as a terminally ill subject. Instead of projecting her own desires and prejudices onto the woman, she listened to what the woman herself, through her body and through her everyday life, had to say. And through this approach, the body of the dying woman, as a vulnerable material, is presented in a way that is collaborative and consent-driven, and not through the lens of a single directorial eye. As a person who frequently writes about illness, I was inspired by Abajos Perez's approach because it shows the banality, and therefore the complexity, I would say, of everyday life with serious illness, and how the emphasis on this banality can help to dismantle the voyeuristic visual prejudices that are prominent in the representation and circulation of dying and otherwise vulnerable bodies. For example, I have to think about many movies that are about people with cancer are very kind of dramatic, and the cancer is kind of the main protagonist. But here, really, the body and the person is the main actor. So the title of the work, I Am Not My Body, therefore functions as both an affirmative statement on behalf of the other who is indeed more than just their body, as well as a critique of the viewer who expects a sentiment-laden portrait of a dying person. With the presentation of these 4 works, I hope to have given you some examples of strategies towards working with vulnerable bodies in an artistic practice. I think all 4 of these works are useful case studies for thinking about the responsibility of the maker as an individual that is embodied as much as their subject. Regardless of intention, a project will fail in its mission of representation if it does not consider the socio-political tensions between the artist and the object, and if the body that is depicted is not given its own voice as well. Whether the depicted body is fictional or real is irrelevant in this case, as the exhibitions by Wig and Perino and also Kessel's show. However, this does not mean that as artists and writers we are immediately in the wrong if we take the body as our material. One way of tackling the ethical issues of agency, responsibility, and ownership, as the work of Jackson shows, is to work with a body that represents the same social-political position as that of the maker. Another way is to make the depicted subject the main focalizer of the work, as Barros Perez did for her documentary. And in closing, I would like to express how much I would have liked to discuss these works with you all in person today. Unfortunately, this is not possible due to the pandemic, but there is a virtual Q&A via YouTube, so if you have any questions about any aspects of this talk, please do send them our way. And if you are at all interested in the topic of vulnerable bodies, sick bodies, and the representation, and if you want to work on this or write about this, I'd be happy to share some of my sources with you. You can find my email address right here. So thank you very much for listening, and to the organizers